systems nominal.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. I'm glad to be back too. I recently returned from our yearly business trip to Vegas with the wife, both my in-laws, my son. It was a very busy time, let me tell you that much. Also had a very nice birthday before that. We're at Battlefield Las Vegas. Seriously, guys, find yourself a woman who not only takes you to see tanks and shoot machine guns for your birthday, but can also handle an MP5 SD on full auto accurately. I mean, I'm a lucky man, let me tell you. And speaking of, good luck, one last thing before we get started. As of this video, the channel just hit the 1,000 subscriber mark. So before we begin, I'd like to say thank you for all of you for watching, for subscribing. That means a lot to me. I mean, this channel, I'd probably be doing this stuff anyway, even if I didn't have much of a viewership, but the fact that people are actually interested in hearing what I have to say and what I did, the stuff that I'm covering, that means a lot to me, so thank you. Yeah. So, Gundam. Yeah, you'd think a guy who spends this much time talking about mechs wouldn't have taken this long to do something on Mobile Suit Gundam, but, here we are. So, there's a new animated film coming with a very weird name. That's the most recent thing. There's Requiem for Vengeance. It's out on Netflix since a couple of months, which I probably should do a video on, except there's this YouTuber named Big Micah C who already did one that pretty much covers everything that I have to say on it. So go watch his in the meantime. I mean, eventually if I ever come up with something I want to say about it personally, then okay, yeah, I'll probably do a video on that, but in the meantime, he pretty much does my definitive take on it, so it's one last thing I have to do. And of course, there's announcements for a live-action Gundam movie in the works. We'll see how well that works, I think, so they've already switched out directors at least. The guy went from the guy who did Skull Island to the guy who did Stakeland, and I like both those movies, but I think one of them is probably better for Gundam than the other, you know what I mean? It's just... But the thing is, what a lot of people have failed to mention is that this is not the first live-action Gundam movie in the works. It's the second one. The first one was a movie that was made right here in Canada, well, over in Vancouver, but still Canada, and it was called G-SAVIOUR. It was directed by a guy named Graham Campbell, produced by Sunrise with Polestar Entertainment, and CGI by a company called Digital Muse. Now, this project originally started up in '95, spearheaded by Koichi Inu at Sunrise, and was completed as part of the 20th anniversary of Mobile Suit Gundam, along with the series Turn A Gundam, which was being made at the same time. It was released theatrically in Japan on June 18, 1999, broadcast on Japanese TV subsequently in December of 2000, and then finally released on DVD in 2002, which is how the rest of us could finally watch it, which is kind of ironic, because it was actually filmed in English and then dubbed in Japanese instead of the other way around, like you would, usually happen with this kind of thing. That's kind of funny in and of itself. Now, before I get started, I have a confession to make. I am at best a casual Gundam fan. I am nowhere near as knowledgeable on the ins and outs of this franchise as some other people out there. I've watched the original series, Zeta, the main classic One Year War OVA, so 8th MS Team, Stardust Memory, and War in the Pocket. They're good stuff, and, played some of the video games, but that's about it. So, don't get me wrong, I like what I've seen. I wouldn't, be covering this stuff if I didn't. But if you twisted my arm, I'd have to say I'm more of a Ryosuke Takahashi guy than a Tomino guy. It's just the way my bread is buttered. One to make stuff that appeals to me a bit more than the other. Is what it is. This may have impacted my take on this movie because from what I've seen, a lot of hardcore Gundam fans hate this thing. Whereas, honestly, I kind of like it. I mean, obviously I like it. I wouldn't be covering it on this channel if I didn't. It's kind of my main principle of the whole thing. I mean, I went in expecting a low-budget sci-fi TV movie from the late 90s, and that's what I got. So I can't say I was in any much danger of being disappointed. But honestly, there's stuff in here that I think is genuinely worth talking about. So, let's get going on that. So, first off, G-SAVIOUR takes place in the Universal Century, the first timeline of Gundam, going from the very beginning, in year 0223. So that's 144 years after the 1 year war from the original Gundam, and the various OVAs I mentioned. and 7 years after Victory Gundam, which is the last series before this one chronologically in that timeline, which makes G-SAVIOUR one of the farthest along in the UC timeline, actually, which is interesting. Now, what that means, being so far into the future of the series, is that there aren't that many callbacks to the older Universal Century series. The factions are different. The people there's no more Zeon. The Earth Federation collapsed fairly recently in the past of this movie. Now, other than, of course, there's this style of military uniforms, things like that, and of course the mobile suit designs that tie in the same similar kind of aesthetic. Now, that can be disappointing for some who would prefer something that ties in more with what came before it, but it also does mean that you don't need to go on a deep dive into Gundam lore to understand this one. The basic premise is, as I mentioned, the Earth Federation's gone, and new factions have filled a vacuum. The main ones here being the Congress of Settlement Nations, or CONSENT. Yeah, you go with it. Which is basically the remnants of the Fedis teamed up with several colonies or settlements, as they call themselves now. There's the Settlement Free League, which didn't want to consent, and Side 8, aka Gaia, which wanted to stay independent of both factions. There's also, I shit you not, the Illuminati. No, I'm not kidding. That's what they call themselves. I think mostly as a bit of a in-joke for themselves, at least at the start. Basically, they're a network of ex-consent members that based around Side 4, who noticed the balance of power in their government shifting towards the bad end and decided to get organized to do something about it behind the scenes, acting as unofficial checks and balances, usually indirectly, but also with their own paramilitary forces when needed, including mobile suits. They got a whole bunch of army vets from Consent that have joined their ranks. They're the ones who actually get our hero the titular G-SAVIOUR mobile suit that he pilots in the movie. So, said hero is also an ex-Congressional Army mobile suit pilot. He's named Mark Curran, who at the start of the movie is working at a deep-sea research lab called Hydrogen, where they're working on undersea agriculture experiments. So, the human population has mostly recovered since the 1-year war cut humanity down by half. The old-fashioned way, not with the old Thanos snap here. People had to be done one by one manually, although there was those colony drops that helped too. So humanity has populations recovered over the 144 years since then, but the Earth hasn't quite. Turns out multiple colony drops and a few genocidal wars have some environmental consequences, As such, there's food shortages, famines are a problem, leading to civil unrest, of course, and problems with the agricultural settlements who have to help feed Earth as well as their own populations, so there's friction there as well. And then one day, out of the blue, or rather out of orbit, there's a CAF mobile suit that crashes into the ocean near the facility, having just barely survived re-entry. Mark manages to save the pilot, but then the army shows up to commandeer the whole facility. It's revealed the pilot had been pursuing some spies from Gaia who managed to break into the Hydrogen lab looking for something, we don't know just yet, only to be caught by Mark's former CO and complete bastard, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Halley. Mark manages to save one of the intruders from getting summarily gunned down by Jack's soldiers who, yes, are wearing the same gear as these soldiers in Power Rangers Lost Galaxy. I know you would like to know more, but let's not dwell on it. We're talking about Gundam, not that. Anyway, turns out her name is Cynthia Graves. She's the daughter of the Gaian chief counselor and a scientist in her own right who's been secretly working with Hydrogen's former director on a bioluminescent enzyme that not only generates a ton of light, like practically sunlight level, but also acts as a heat source that could revolutionize undersea agriculture and help solve the food crisis. As she says, 3/4 of the Earth's surface is water. There's a lot of room to grow stuff, Which, unfortunately, some members of the Consent military don't want brought to light, since said crisis gives them more authority and power within the government to, crack down, because of all the crackdowns that they have to do on the population as they get, a little bit uppity from lack of food. So naturally, Mark and Cynthia end up on the run with a sample, trying to get back to Gaia before Jack and his goons can get a hold of them. And along the way, of course, Mark gets the G-SAVIOUR, gets very close to Cynthia, and we eventually get our big mobile suit fight at the end around Side 8. So, the plot here, it's not all that deep, and at an hour and a half runtime, you're not going to see the same kind of character development or world building you get from a full series or even from an OVA, but what is here honestly works for what it is. The actors playing the leads do a solid job with what they've got to work with. Brendan Elliott as Mark and Inuka Okuma as Cynthia, who, actually, fun fact, it turns out later on did the voice for Lady Une in the English dub of Gundam Wing, so that's kind of cool. So you got David Lovgren as Jack, was enjoyably evil in this. He definitely seemed to be enjoying himself, that's for sure. And I think the only member of the cast I didn't like was a guy named Alfonso Quijada, who played one of Cynthia's allies. I just didn't like the way he delivered his lines. It's just, it bugged me. I will say I was pleasantly surprised to see the late Kenneth Welsh as General Garneau. I didn't realize going in that he was going to be in this movie. That was a nice surprise right there. I first saw him as Wyndham Earle in Twin Peaks back when that aired. And last film I saw him in was 2016's The Void, which I highly recommend you go out and watch because that's a great goddamn horror movie. Like damn good actor too. So yeah, the story or characters won't knock your socks off or anything, but it's far from the kind of cringy cheese fest that I've seen it described as. Like, honestly, it actually kind of gives me some Zeta vibes to it. The bad guys being a hardline military faction within the government, and the Illuminati acting a bit like the AUG stand-in. It's not really more than vibes, but the premise does give me a bit that feeling. It's comparable in that regard. Of course, it doesn't help that this is actually the middle part of the story. There's actually a prequel in the form of a radio drama series and a sequel on PlayStation 2 of all places, which incidentally was the first Gundam video game to be released on that console. So another first right there. That one spends more time on Earth and calls back more to the events of the Universal Century if you're interested, if that was a problem you had with this movie. Also, all the voices are in English, which is weird since the game wasn't released outside of Japan and all the text is in Japanese. It's like, okay, I mean, I'm not complaining. I can actually understand the plot that way, And there's also a 2-volume novelization of the movie that fleshes out the story, which I haven't been able to find an English translation of that, unfortunately. So, suffice to say, there's more meat on the bone here than you'd expect from just some throwaway low-budget B-movie. It's just that a lot of it isn't in the actual movie, which is, unfortunate. Now, what about the mechs, I hear you ask? They honestly look pretty good, even though they were working with, 90s CGI, which isn't surprising considering they were designed by none other than Kunio Okawara, the mechanical designer on the original Mobile Suit Gundam and like much of the rest of the franchise. This guy's got some serious credits to him. This guy knows his mobile suits, that's for sure. And the CG here, it's about on par with something like series of the time, like Space Above and Beyond or Babylon 5, where, yeah, it looks dated in comparison to the kind of stuff we have now, but it still holds up well enough that I can suspend my disbelief and go with it, same when I'm watching those shows. It helps that there aren't too many occasions where they try to combine live action and CG elements. Those always stand out the most when you're doing this kind of thing. I love the actual physical cockpits they have in this. Those give you some great MechWarrior 4 vibes, like the intro to that, when they're setting everything up. Yeah, that kind of feeling to it, which I really enjoy. Anyway, on the content side, you have the CCMS-03 Bugu. Again, the strange names for mechs, they're characteristic of Gundam right there. And the CAMS-13 MS Rai, which from the moment you see the kind of Zakuish mono eye on the former one, you know immediately, yeah, these are the bad guys. Yeah. And just to bring the point home, the Gaians and the final battle use old leftover Federation mobile suits, specifically the RGM-196 Freedom, so, GIMs. So the video movie really keeps that Universal Century's visual iconography, the GIMs and Gundams being on the side of the good guys, the Zaku-ish looking ones being on the side of the bad guys. There's also the aquatic mobile suit that Mark pilots at the start. It's called the MMS DS-209 Guppy, which I like just because it's nice to see mechs being used outside of combat, just, as a part of daily life. It kind of grounds them into the setting as opposed to being something separate that just intrudes whenever there's a war going on, But, of course, the standout is obviously the G-SAVIOUR itself, which is a pretty standard design in that it looks like a proper Gundam. Nothing too crazy or out there, which is how I prefer them, honestly. Once things get a bit too abstract and spiky, I kind of tune out at that point. So, one recurring complaint that I've seen is that the tech seems to have regressed compared to stuff like Victory Gundam or Gundam Unicorn, which is another series from the late Universal Century, which I can definitely see bothering people coming off series like those or Gundam Wing and then watching this. Like, For instance, the grunt suits, the Bagu or Freedom, they mostly use ballistic weaponry versus the beam rifles that had become standard after the One-Year War. The main hero and villain suits have the traditional Vulcan machine guns, along with beam sabers and beam rifles, and beam shields, which are something that first appeared in the Gundam F91 movie and kept on going forward. So that's basically the most high-tech thing they got there, no bits or any kind of those kinds of things. One explanation that I've read from a translated article, which first appeared in a book called the G-SAVIOUR Full Weapon Book, was that the North American staff thought that using solid ammo instead of energy weapons would create a more grounded, real atmosphere. Now, whether or not you agree with that sentiment, it does bring me to a central point, which is what really made me want to cover this movie in the first place. This is a Gundam story written and directed by Westerners before Gundam had managed to really penetrate into Western culture. Because don't forget, it wasn't until Gundam Wing premiered on Toonami after this movie was made that the franchise really took off in North America, outside of a fairly niche audience of anime enthusiasts. That's the one that really put Gundam on the map in the English-speaking world. I compare it a bit to the way that, the folks at FASA took mech designs from various mecha anime, Dougram, Macross, Crusher Joe, and then used them in their then new wargame Battletech, filtering those Japanese designs through their own perceptions and ideas to come up with something that was a little bit different there. It's the same thing as something like Heavy Gear and Votoms, or Jovian Chronicles and Gundam, actually. It's the same thing here. You can tell that these mobile suits are being presented through that perspective. And case in point, the emphasis is very much on the size and weight of the mobile suits. Their movements are heavier than in the animes, more ponderous. And they even added the sounds of hydraulics as they move to really reinforce that. Same thing a bit in space, with an added detail that I only noticed after watching it a few times. Mobile suits maneuver in zero-G in two ways in this movie. They're thrusters, obviously, but also moving their limbs to affect their inertia and center of gravity, what's referred to in Gundam as active mass balance autocontrol, or AMBAC, which is essentially what real-life astronauts do when they're on their own out in black, just adjusting their positioning in certain ways in order to rotate without having to, deal with thrusters and verniers and stuff like that. It's probably the main reason why you'd want to have a spaceborne vehicle to have limbs in the first place, so you're not spending reaction mass through your verniers every time you want to turn around. Meaning that somebody put some serious thought, definitely went into how the mobile suits in G-SAVIOUR were depicted. This isn't just, pulling shit out of their ass. Some actual thought went into this. I think really, going back to, I mentioned Gundam F91, the biggest flaw the movie has is what it shares with that one, which was going to be a series before, for various budgetary reasons and stuff like that, it got compressed into a single movie. It lacks the runtime or budget to really go in depth, either in terms of themes or world building, characters. There's the other media I mentioned previously, the radio drama, the video game, the novelizations that expand on things. But as a standalone piece, I wish this had gotten at least a mini-series like Dune did in 2000. Hell, the CG in this isn't all that different quality-wise, there's just less of it, which I will say, I would have definitely liked to see more mech action. I mean, there's a whole other Gundam I haven't even mentioned yet, piloted by a friend of Mark's in the Illuminati, that barely shows up near the end. And also the G-SAVIOUR's big trick, which is that it's a base frame that can be converted from space to ground type by switching out its outer armor, is only used near the end to deal with a pair of Bagus that landed on Side 8, and by then, the movie's almost over, We do get, some decent mech fighting during the finale, and we get some character development, especially with Mark dealing with the guilt of failing to save a fellow pilot during his army days. But there just isn't time for much else. And yes, the romance between him and Cynthia is a bit quick, to say the least. It's another reason I wish this thing had a bit more time to breathe. Maybe, bring in some of the other mobile suits from the video game. There was some cool-looking ones there. Like the version of the G3 Savior with the skate wheels. Always liked the mix with those. I think, ultimately, G-SAVIOUR is best looked at as a time capsule of a moment just before Gundam reached popular awareness in the English-speaking world, and also as a bit of a what-if, because I can imagine an alternate timeline where Battletech or Heavy Gear would get the live-action treatment on the basis of something like this being successful. I mean, If a show that looked like the opening of MechWarrior 4 or the FMVs in the first Heavy Gear game had come out in the 90s, I'd have been all over that. And don't lie to yourself, a lot of you would have been too, you know? And as for the Gundam fans who dislike this movie, I get that a lot of it is a matter of taste, and that's fine, but the hate I've seen for G-SAVIOUR is way overblown. I mean, it's not even the worst Gundam-related thing out there. Remember Kukuru's Dome's Island? Remember the War for Earth? Yeah. In any case, it may not be a masterpiece, but G-SAVIOUR doesn't deserve to be forgotten. And I think it's worth checking out if only as an enjoyable sci-fi popcorn flick that you can just, put on, watch for an hour and a half, and be entertained. Plus, it's already uploaded to YouTube on the Internet Archive, so you really got no excuse, Just remember, it's not a guilty pleasure if there's nothing to feel guilty about. So I've been Zero Sum. This has been G-SAVIOUR. Thank you for watching. Thank you all for my subscribers for subscribing. We are going to be going into this for the long haul. I got more videos coming. But in the meantime, I'm ejecting. Bye-bye.
All primary objectives complete. Mission successful.